In the German army of the early 1940s, an ordinary conscript was paid roughly 50 pfennigs a day, half a Reichsmark. A field marshal, at the very top of the same army, was paid roughly 60 times that every single day. And by the end of this video, you will meet the people who out-earned even that field marshal, and none of them ever wore a uniform. This is a story about pay, not politics. Every rank of the German army in this period had a wage set in Reichsmarks, and behind every wage, a life that rank alone rarely explained. Today, we climb it rung by rung. The conscript, the corporal, the lieutenant, the colonel, the field marshal, and then we open the books on how far a single day's pay actually stretched at every single level. This is Rank and Ledger. In today's episode, the German army pay scale of the early 1940s, rank by rank. What each level was actually paid, and what that pay could and could not buy. We start with the ordinary conscript, whose pay was barely enough to buy the small comforts of camp life. One thing before we climb. If you want to see who really gets paid in worlds like this, armies, empires, ancient kingdoms, subscribe now and leave a like. It genuinely decides whether this channel survives. An ordinary conscript was paid what the army called Wehrsold, a base soldier's allowance of around 50 pfennigs to 1 Reichsmark a day depending on the year. On top of his food and lodging, that was essentially pocket money. That worked out to somewhere between 15 and 30 Reichsmarks a month, at a time when an average skilled factory worker back home earned closer to 190. That pay bought very little beyond tobacco, letters home, and the occasional small treat from a canteen truck. Everything that actually mattered, food, uniform, boots, rifle, was issued, not purchased. So the conscript's entire economic life narrowed down to almost nothing beyond what the army chose to provide him. His wage was less a salary and more a small monthly reminder that he still technically existed as an individual. And most of his true material needs were entirely outside his control. Uniforms, boots, and weapons were state property, tracked, inspected, and replaced only through official channels. Losing or damaging equipment could mean a deduction from that same tiny wage, or worse, formal punishment. Here is your first question, and answer it honestly in the comments below. If your entire pay covered nothing more than tobacco and postage stamps, would money have meant anything to you at all in that life? Tell me below. The only way out of that world was a promotion, and with it, the first real jump in both pay and authority. One rung up, a small but real jump in pay, came with a small but real jump in responsibility. A junior non-commissioned officer, a corporal, earned a noticeably higher wage than the conscripts under him, closer to the pay of an ordinary skilled worker back home, plus additional allowances depending on his exact role. He was the rank that actually ran daily life for the men beneath him. Drill, inspection, discipline, all fell to him personally, long before any officer ever needed to get involved. It was a strange kind of power. He could not offer the men beneath him a single extra Reichsmark for good behavior, and he could not find them either. His only real currency was reputation, and the small informal respect of men who knew he had once stood exactly where they were standing now. For that responsibility, he earned barely more than an ordinary factory worker at home, while carrying a level of daily authority over other men's lives that almost no civilian job of the same pay would ever have handed him. And promotion to this rank was not simply handed out. It typically required a minimum length of service and a recommendation from the officers above him, meaning a corporal's stripes were earned slowly, one inspection and one report at a time. Cross that promotion line into the officer class entirely, and the pay scale finally starts to look like a different economy altogether. Above the non-commissioned ranks entirely stood the officer class, and here the pay finally starts to separate from the ordinary soldier's world. A junior officer earned roughly 270 Reichsmarks a month, including his own separate officer's allowance on top of base pay. That put him solidly above the average civilian wage for the first time on this entire ladder. That single jump from non-commissioned to commissioned officer was the single largest pay increase on the entire ladder relative to the rank just below it. It was, in every practical sense, the true dividing line of this army's economy. It was also a genuine social crossing. A commissioned officer was addressed differently, saluted differently, and expected to socialize in an entirely different circle from the men he had, in some cases, served alongside as an ordinary soldier only a few years earlier. An officer also had privileges no enlisted man ever received. His own quarters, a batman to look after his kit and uniform, and a mess where meals were noticeably better than anything served to the men he commanded. He also carried real financial obligations that came with the rank. Uniforms above a certain quality were often purchased at the officer's own expense, meaning even a comfortable salary could be quietly eaten by the cost of simply looking the part. And becoming an officer at all required real investment. Officer candidates went through lengthy, expensive training separate from ordinary conscription, a path that historically favored young men whose families could already afford the years of schooling it required before the Army ever paid them a proper wage. Here is your second question for the comments. If a single promotion from non-commissioned to commissioned rank could double your pay and completely change how you were housed and fed, would that gap change how hard you worked to earn it? Tell me below. Climb one more rung, and the officer's comfortable life starts to look almost modest. And remember the promise from the very start. Even the richest man in uniform is about to be out-earned by people who never wore one at all. Climb further up the officer ranks, and the pay begins to separate even more sharply from anyone beneath it. A colonel's household allowance, meanwhile, was calculated to reflect an entirely different standard of living, one that assumed a family home, servants of his own, and social entertaining. The ordinary soldier could never have imagined affording on any wage at all. A senior officer commanding a regiment earned several times a junior lieutenant's pay, alongside a household allowance, a car and driver, and staff assigned personally to him. For generations before this period, the most senior ranks of the German officer corps had been dominated by old aristocratic families, the Junker class, whose sons had commanded armies for 100 years before this one. By the early 1940s, that tradition was already fading, as the Army's rapid growth and the political leadership's own suspicion of the old aristocracy pushed many career officers of noble birth out of the most senior commands. Pause the video here and guess. If a lieutenant earned around 270 Reichsmarks a month, what do you think the very top rank of this entire army, the field marshal, actually earned? Type your guess in the comments before I tell you. I will wait. Locked in your guess? Here comes the top of the ladder. A field marshal, the very highest active rank in the army, earned roughly 3,000 Reichsmarks a month, including his own personal Wehrsold, on top of a base salary already far beyond anyone else on this ladder. Roughly 100 times what the conscript at the very bottom of this ladder was paid. For a rank that rarely, if ever, faced the immediate physical danger the conscript faced every single day. And rank offered no real protection from the war's deepest cost. Officers and enlisted men alike appear, in significant numbers, on the casualty lists of this period. Whatever the pay scale promised, it could not buy its way out of the front line entirely. And even his pay could not buy him out of the risks of command entirely. A field marshal was still expected to visit the front, inspect his troops in person, and take personal responsibility for the decisions made in his name. However far from the front his own headquarters usually sat, if you guessed high, you were right too. And yet even that enormous figure looks almost modest compared to what a handful of civilians in this same period could earn entirely outside the army altogether. So, who really topped this ladder? Not the field marshal at all. A famous state opera singer of the period could earn as much as 30,000 Reichsmarks in a single month, roughly 10 times the field marshal's entire monthly pay, for singing rather than commanding an army. That single comparison tells you almost everything about how this whole economy actually worked. Military rank bought command, uniforms, and real authority over other men's lives. It did not, even at its absolute highest point, buy the largest paycheck in the country. And this pay scale looked very different from the armies fighting on the other side of the same war. A German conscript earned a small fraction of an American private's wage, and the gap only grew stranger from there. By some wartime comparisons, an American private stationed abroad received pay and allowances roughly equal to a British colonel's salary. On this ladder, an ordinary foot soldier in one army could, on paper, out-earn a senior officer in another. And none of this pay at any rank ever accounted for what came after. For the men who survived, wounded or whole, a pension system existed on paper, but it depended entirely on the collapse and reconstruction of an entire country before most veterans ever saw a stable payment again. So, here is the final ledger of this army's pay scale. The conscript earned barely enough for tobacco and stamps, for a life that could ask everything of him and gave him almost nothing in return. The corporal ran daily discipline for barely more than a civilian wage. The lieutenant crossed the single biggest pay line on the entire ladder the moment he was commissioned. The colonel added a car, a household, and staff to that same growing gap. And the field marshal, 100 times richer than the conscript beneath him, still earned only a fraction of what the country's most famous civilian performers could command in a single month, entirely outside any uniform at all. In this ladder, as in every world we climb on this channel, the highest uniform in the room was never quite the highest paycheck in the country. So, here is your last question, and it is the one that matters most. If rank rarely bought the biggest paycheck even inside its own army, was military rank ever really about money at all? Or was it always about something else entirely? Tell me below. I read every comment. Next time on Rank and Ledger, we climb one of two ladders and you decide which, the CIA or a hedge fund. Vote in the comments. And if this story held you, do the two things that keep this channel climbing. Leave a like and subscribe. The ladder continues.